Hey, this is Brian Yellow, and I am welcoming you to Origins, Stories on Creativity. This is going to be our 6th episode. On today's show, I'll be talking with Frank Joseph. Our conversation was interesting. We talked a lot about his experiences as a journalist. As always, check out the website, brianayellow.com. Follow me on Twitter at BRYAIELLO. Check out the show notes for Frank Joseph. A lot of contact information there. He did promise to give a discount to anybody who mentioned the show. Free shipping on his website. All that information will be on the website. And enjoy our talk. Getting started. All right. We are on the air with Frank Joseph. He is the author of the Chicago Trilogy, a wonderful series of novels that have actually been getting a little bit of accolades with some contests. His first book, To Love Mercy, is available on his website. He has a great history with the city of Chicago. Hello, Mr. Joseph. How are you doing today?
Hello, Brian. I'm doing great. Nice to meet you.
Fantastic. So we met each other like almost a decade ago, I think, at this point. And first off, tell me about your novel a little bit.
Sure.
Your first one, To Love Mercy.
Sure. The first one, To Love Mercy, is the first novel in the Chicago Trilogy. And it's set over 5.5 days in June of 1948. And it throws together a 10-year-old white kid from kind of a privileged background in Hyde Park, which is also Barack Obama's neighborhood, also is the neighborhood I grew up in,
Okay.
and a kid who is a child of the ghetto, the black ghetto, then known as Bronzeville, which was kind of Chicago's Harlem, a very fascinating, vibrant neighborhood in which my grandfather, Nathan Joseph, owned a movie theater called the States Theater, which is right in the heart of Bronzeville, 3507 South State Street. There's also a movie theater in this novel that is modeled very much on my grandfather's movie theater, and a character named Nate, who's modeled very much on my grandfather, and another character named Dora, who is a domestic, a maid, we called them back in those days, for the White family, Steve's White family, and also a parishioner in the storefront church of the black character Sass's father. I think I may be getting lost in the weeds here a little bit, so let me just sort of start over.
Well, no, I wanted to ask you a question. Bronzeville, you said Brownsville, right?
Bronzeville.
Is that the south portion of Chicago that we would currently know as the very, very hotbed of gang activity in the Chicago area?
Oh, absolutely not. No. Not at all. No, that is the west side, and that is exactly the turf on which the third and final novel is set, which I have just finished. In fact, I have just sent off copies of the third and final novel in the trilogy to 3 literary agents today who requested to see it.
Congratulations. That's wonderful.
Thank you.
Yeah, but you've already won a contest for that third book in the trilogy.
As a matter of fact, I did. The opening scenes won the Scintillating Starts contest. So you can prepare your readers, hopefully, for a scintillating start. I think it's fairly scintillating.
Well, I mean, obviously, you love this era that you're writing in, the 1950s Chicago. I mean, I'm very curious to know your opinion of your hometown now. Well,
it's a terrible thing, really. I mean, the Chicago that I write of is long gone. It was a place where the snow turned dirty from coal dust and you couldn't breathe the air. And you know, a democratic machine ruled the politics of the city, and people worked in factories, and it was a great city, but it was a very, very different kind of place. Now, anybody who goes to Chicago and just stays near the lake is going to think, well, this is one of the great, one of the great metropolises of the world, which it is, which it was then, and which it is now, and it's a wonderful place. But the Chicago the tourists see is not the Chicago really that's in the news, and that Chicago is the Chicago that I am writing about 50 years ago, where really nothing has changed. 50 years ago, it led to repeated riots, that tore those neighborhoods apart. These days, the same kinds of forces are leading to gang violence and murder. But they really are the same forces, and they are happening in exactly the same place. The worst neighborhood in Chicago, which is called North Lawndale, is the neighborhood where the worst riots in Chicago took place in 1965 and 1966. There were two of them, 2 summers in a row, and it is those, particularly the Lawndale riot, that the current novel, the last novel in the trilogy, is set.
So it's like your experiences with those riots were as an AP reporter, correct?
That's covered those riots.
So you were witnessing history firsthand.
I was a very lucky guy in that regard, although
I bet you didn't feel it at the time.
Well, no, I did. It was very exciting. Although I also covered the Detroit riot. I covered Dr. King's marches, including the infamous one into Cicero, Illinois, which ended in a great deal of violence. And the Detroit riot, which is the most devastating urban riot in America's history in terms of loss of life, property damage, and injury. If I remember right, 38 people died. And the Democratic National Convention disorders of 1968, which really have become history. I was shot at in Detroit. I didn't like that particularly. No. I was trapped under a fire engine with the firemen by gunfire while we watched a frame house burn to the ground, and firefighters couldn't fight the fire because people were shooting at us. We were on our bellies and in the dirt underneath the fire truck. An incident, by the way, which finds itself into this novel I've just finished, to do justice. I really rely, those times are so few. All these novels are fiction. The events in these novels didn't happen, although a few of the characters are real characters, and many of the characters are based on people in my growing up and young adulthood. But they are fiction, but they are based very much on fact and very much on the reality that was Chicago then, and quite, as you point out, still is Chicago in many ways.
It sounds like your experiences play a lot into your creativity.
They do. This not, and it's an opportunity to bring back your life. I sometimes say to people, everybody should write a novel, and I really believe that. It isn't therapy, but it does some of the same things that therapy does. And I think back to when I was writing To Love Mercy, the first novel in the trilogy, which is really set in my childhood, and from my childhood. And one of the characters is this woman who is named Dora in the novel, and she was named Dora in real life too, who was my caregiver, from the time I was 6 years old until the time I was, entering my teen years. She was the one who was there when my sister and I would come home after school, and she was the one who would bring out the milk and the cookies. And I remember vividly, this is the first time I ever tried to write a novel. It was a brand new experience to me. And I'm sitting there in a dark basement writing about Dora Winfield, who was in the novel. Her name is Dora Barfield, but writing about Dora, and tears come to my eyes. And I wasn't crying. It was the strangest experience. But tears came to my eyes, and they just flowed down my cheeks. And I didn't know what the heck was happening, because I wasn't crying, but something was happening. And I sort of ran upstairs to my wife and I said, Carol. And I told her about this experience. And then I went back downstairs and, and it passed. And then it happened again some weeks later. And the second time it happened, I started to realize that what had happened was I touched something very deep in myself. And those tears were the result of the thing that, whatever the thing was that I had touched, that was really deep inside me. And I realized that was a good thing. That was a place I wanted to go if I could. And it was a place I very, it's a hard place to get to, and
No, yeah, absolutely.
especially if you're trying to get there on purpose. But every once in a while, you get there by accident. And
Well, I mean, if you're going to be writing memoirish fiction, you're going to want to touch some places that not necessarily you're even aware exist. And it sounds like that's what you did with your caregiver. Had you ever tried to write fiction before sitting down to pen Tale of Mercy?
oh yeah. I was actually a creative writing major in college.
Oh yeah, me too.
I wound up in journalism, but I didn't. And I'd done journalism as a kid. I'd been in my high school paper, and I always kind of loved it and was drawn to it. But I never really wanted to do it for a living. What I wanted to do for a living was write novels and live in a garret. So when I was 21 and at 22, I graduated from college, and it was my plan to become a novelist, actually, although I hadn't written any more than about 40 pages of a terrible novel that had to be thrown away. But I had written stories. And
you didn't keep your 40 pages?
I wish I had. I would.
Right?
I've thought about that. And I've even searched around, rummaged around in the papers. They are gone.
I'm a child of the electronic age, and I have had so much fiction disappear because floppy disks are items of the devil. 75 pages worth of fiction gone because of, USB drives breaking on me. Yeah, I feel your pain.
you can't lose a file anymore. It's impossible.
No, you can't. The cloud's got it all. I mean, they take us out. They might take it too, but it's all going to be stuck someplace.
There's a wonderful movie starring Michael Douglas called Wonder Boys, based on the novel by Michael Chabon. And the critical scene in that novel, in that movie, he's been slaving for years over this great work of his. He's a novelist. And he's outside, and the box containing the manuscript flies open, and all the pages fly up in the air. And it's this wonderful moment. I'm watching this on the screen, and I'm just so personally involved with this. And I could talk about feeling the pain, but that couldn't happen anymore.
I remember the scene being kind of bittersweet for him, though. He loses the novel, but it's kind of like cathartic in a way.
Yeah.
Like, I'll start something new. And then he does, doesn't he? He writes something new, and it's better than when he was the 1,000-page
but just
genealogy of horses or whatever.
Just about the time of the movie, the hard drive was coming in, and that wonderful cataclysmic scene could not happen again.
No, anymore from that point on, unless you're slaving away over a typewriter, which those things are hardly ever in existence anymore.
Right. But if I were to see that novel that I started when I was a senior in college, I know I would cringe with every word. I can still remember pieces of it, and I cringe even thinking about it.
When was your senior year at college?
I graduated from Northwestern University in Evanston, Illinois in 1962.
1962. So you graduated, 1963 happens, and the whole world just changes as a 22-year-old kid. You're getting into the press corps.
Yeah, that's right. Because I didn't become a novelist. When I was 22, I wanted to be a novelist, and when I was 22 and a half, I decided I wanted to eat 3 meals a day. So I started interviewing for journalism jobs, jobs. I remember when I got out of college, my first week I interviewed at publishers, and there are no publishers in Chicago. There were some textbook publishers back then. Scott Forsman was in Chicago, but there were no trade publishers to speak of. So, I started hearing, well, you're a nice young man, and when you get your military service out of the way, come back and we'll have a serious conversation. At that time, the Vietnam War was heating up, and there was a draft. So the second week, I decided to interview for magazines, and there was one magazine in Chicago, basically, and that was Playboy, and I don't even think I ever got an interview with Playboy. And the third week, I decided to interview for newspapers, which were kind of the, bottom tier, and I kept hearing the same thing from prospective jobs. They would say, you're a nice young man, come back after you get your military service out of the way and we'll have a serious conversation. And then I went into the City News Bureau of Chicago, which is a famous training ground, sadly no longer in existence. It was in existence for 109 years, and then it finally gave up the ghost. But at the time I was a young graduate from Northwestern, City News Bureau was very much in existence. I had an interview there with the longtime general manager, Mr. Ike Gershman, and Gersh talks to me for 20 minutes or so, and he offers me a job. And I did something as a 22-year-old that I look back on and I kind of wonder at myself. I said, excuse me, Mr. Gershman, I probably shouldn't ask you this question, but I've been interviewing at other places, and they're all sort of saying, come back after I get my military service out of the way, but you just offered me a job. He said, don't worry about that. Nobody lasts longer than 6 months here. But I actually lasted a year and a half. I did my 6 months. Then I went into the Army under the old 6-month plan. And I came back out and I worked for City News for another year. It was the most fun you can have without being in bed. It was just an unbelievable experience. It was a throwback to the days of the front page. And in fact, one of my bosses, the Day City editor, Larry Millay, was a model for one of the important characters in that play, The Front Page, by Ben Hecht and Charlie MacArthur. The character Bensinger, who's the prissy one, who always keeps his desk, sort of cleaned off, and doesn't like anybody leaving germs by using his telephone and stuff like that. That character, the model for that character was Larry Millay, who was an obsessive hand washer and would get up every 10 minutes and go over to the sink in the office and wash his hands obsessively, every 10 minutes, literally.
Wow.
And the reason MacArthur and Hecht called the character Bensinger in the play was because when Larry was a young man covering criminal courts, which is where the play is set, in the press room of criminal courts, he would wipe his telephone off, the story goes, with benzene. So they named the character Bensinger after that particular tick. So anyway.
So your second novel is actually about the riot.
Well,
your character, I would imagine, is a reporter, right?
Well, we're flashing forward now.
Okay.
But the third and final novel, which is called To Do Justice, which, as I said before, has basically just been finished in a state that I'm ready to send it out to the world, is set during the riots in 1965 and 1966. And it's narrated by two women, by two girls. One of them, a 23-year-old white woman who was a reporter for the Associated Press and in love with a colleague who won't give her a tumble because he, in turn, is in love with a bitchy, beautiful, blonde television reporter who was a school chum of my poor character, Molly, who was so lovelorn for Steve. And the other narrator is an 11-year-old girl who is a child of the meanest streets out on the West Side. And her nickname is Pinky because she believes herself to be black, and she is raised black, as it were, but she looks to the world as if she's white. Most of the world mistakes her for white because of her coloring and her features. So Pinky, the dream of her life is to find the white woman who gave birth to her. And during the riots, the first riot that erupts right on her street, it gives her the opportunity to make a break. So she flees from the kind of woman, this careless caretaker of a woman who has been raising her, whose name is Jolene, and just goes, lights out for the territory, starts walking until she encounters a storefront church and goes in, and they give her help, and they put her together with a woman named Mrs. Sawhill, Elizabeth Sawhill, whose nickname is Nizzy, who is a precinct captain out on the West Side. She is the queen bee of the 43rd Ward. She rules her ward with stealth and guile. She is the most powerful woman in North Lawndale. She is a hunchback crone, and she is a very central character to this story. And she is living a lonely life, and she takes Pinky in, and Pinky basically goes to live with Mrs. Sawhill for a year. And Pinky's life away from Jolene becomes very good indeed, because Mrs. Sawhill is a wealthy woman. And she owns a 3-flat free and clear, and she has the first floor, and rents out the second and third floors. She has the only house on the block that has flowers and a garden growing around it. And she lives the life, and she is a very powerful person. And Pinky, for her part, is glad to be away from her original life, and the only thing that she misses is her beloved baby sister, Bettina. And I don't want to go too much into the weeds of this novel, but eventually the riots will erupt and disrupt this life, and eventually Pinky will go on a search for her birth mother, and she will find her in the most unexpected of places. And many other things will happen, and it'll be a hell of a read.
Let me ask you this: when you're writing, what are you most focused on? Are you focused on the world in which your characters are living in, or are you focused on your characters and the world itself wraps itself around them?
I am focused on my character.
So when you started out to write, we're going to deal with the third novel for right now, and we'll go to the second and the first one, because the first one's How I Know You. The first one's interesting, sure. And it sounds like what we're talking about still exists in Chicago. But okay, the question is, who did you start with? Who were you most interested in with your third novel, and why?
Oh, well, I got to think about that for a second. I'm not sure whether. Oh yes, no way. I'm thinking this. You caught me by surprise by the question, but I know the answer. About 5 or 6 years ago, I wrote a novel that I was calling The Sweet Guy, calling A Sweet Guy, or The Pulitzer. And the narrator of that novel was Molly, this 23-year-old reporter for the AP, who is hopelessly in love with Steve, who won't give her a tumble. And that whole story started, 6 or 8 years ago or so, with that novel, which I sort of abandoned in the middle because I painted myself into a number of corners, couldn't see my way out. But Molly was a great character. He was a terrific character. So I put that novel aside, and then I started to write To Do Justice. And I vividly remember where I was when I wrote the first chapter of To Do Justice, the one that won the award, that won the Scintillating Starts contest. I remember exactly where I was when I wrote that Scintillating Start. I was in a hotel room on the north side of Chicago. I was in town for a few days. I don't remember exactly why. And there was a terrible storm, and all travel out of town was canceled. And so I was stuck in Chicago for a couple more days. And so I started writing that novel in this hotel room. And Pinky just sort of came to me out of nowhere. She just came to me. I started writing in her voice. And this is what I said about character. Character to me is everything.
Mm-hmm.
Place is terrific, and story is essential.
Is Chicago a character to you?
Oh, Chicago's a character in all 3 of these novels. Chicago is definitely a character in all 3 of these novels, and I am very, very interested in Chicago as a place, as a state of mind, as a happening in time. It's very, very important to me. But I think the most important thing really is getting to know these people. Some of them I invent out of whole. Pinky is nearly invented out of whole cloth. She may be a little bit inspired by my daughter, who is adopted, and also my son. Both of our kids are adopted. And my daughter that have some parallels with the experiences that Pinky has. But I don't really think I modeled Pinky on my daughter, Sean.
So I'm sorry, you broke up a little bit on me. Did you say that both of your children are multiracial?
No, they're both adopted. Well, my daughter is multiracial. My son was born in Santiago, Chile, so he's Latin.
Okay.
And so there are some parallels with my daughter, who's multiracial, and Pinky, who's multiracial. But I don't think of my daughter being the model for Pinky at all, really. But there are some things about the life that my daughter lived, and before she became our daughter, because she was raised by other people, by friends of ours. There are parallels, and I think probably some of that is in there. Maybe more of that is in there than I'm aware. And but the main thing that's in there is the adoption story. The adoption story is a big part of this novel that I'm writing.
Mm-hmm.
There's the riots, which is a big part of the story, and there's the adoption and the quest for the birth mother, the missing birth mother, and there's of course always the question of race, which is my subject. I mean, that is the thing.
Yeah.
About is race.
You're very, very curious about that, and you definitely want to put, tens of thousands of words behind an explanation. Where do you think that comes from?
I'll tell you where it comes from. Cast your mind back to Love Mercy, which you've read, the first novel in this trilogy, and the situation in To Love Mercy. We have a young white boy named Steve Feinberg, who's Jewish and grew up in Hyde Park, which at that time was a fairly heavily Jewish neighborhood and a prosperous neighborhood, the University of Chicago. So, it was, in a lot of ways, it was a similar neighborhood to the way it is now, although I think a lot more Jewish and a lot more black now. Anyway, it was a prosperous neighborhood, and my dad, made a good living. He worked in the movie business, and his dad owned a movie theater 30 blocks away in the heart of Bronzeville, the place where Negroes, as they were called then, had to live. Chicago was de facto the most segregated city in America in the 1940s. And just about every person of color who lived in Chicago was squeezed into Bronzeville, an area only maybe a mile or two, square, and the boundaries were rigidly defined. One of them was railroad tracks on the west. And, there were various other natural and man-made boundaries that kind of kept people in. And there were things called restrictive covenants then, which later were declared illegal by the Supreme Court, but then basically had the force of law that allowed landlords to discriminate in housing and make sure, that certain places blacks couldn't move into and other places basically were kind of reserved for blacks. And that was what Bronzeville was. But an entire community grew up in Bronzeville, and it was a city within a city. And it was a fascinating place. There was great music, there was great entertainment, there were restaurants, there was an entire culture, and it was an all-black enclave in an otherwise pretty much all-white city. And my grandpa, Nathan, ran a movie theater smack in the middle of this place. And so my dad would take me down there when I was 6, and we would approach this neighborhood. And my dad would say to me, as we approached Bronzeville, he would say, "Lock the doors." I'm only 6 years old. This is a hard thing for a 6-year-old kid to process, and I'm having trouble processing it. But although I may be naive, I'm not stupid. And something's going on here, and I'm getting a message that we are about to enter a very dangerous place. And that message was reinforced for me in a lot of different ways. And I grew up thinking that Bronzeville was a very dangerous place for a white person, and my grandpa's movie theater was a very dangerous place inside a very dangerous place. Although, interestingly, my grandpa, who was as white as you could wish a person to be and was about 5'2" and bald as an egg, and was in his 60s when I knew him, went to that theater every day of his life for 50 years, 7 days a week, most weeks. And nothing ever happened to Nathan Joseph that I am aware of. Things did happen, but nothing ever happened to Nate. So, this is not something I thought through when I was 6 years old. But then I become an adult, and many, many years pass, decades pass, and I get it in my mind to start writing this novel. And I write the first 3 chapters or so, and I get to this point where I feel like I'm sort of standing at the edge of a cliff looking down, and I can't take another step forward. And I realize the problem is I don't understand Bronzeville. So in my 50s, I make arrangements, visit Chicago, go to Chicago for a week or two, and do research, the core of which was tracking down people, black people, who grew up in Bronzeville in the 40s and 50s, and interviewing them about their lives and their experiences. And this I did. And this was a fun, wonderful experience, because here I learned that although me and the other white people in Chicago viewed Bronzeville as a dangerous, crime-ridden place, the people who lived in Bronzeville thought it was home, and it was the only safe place in an otherwise city. It was a place where people didn't lock their doors. It was a place where adults watched out for other people's kids. It was a real small town, a real closely knit community where people stuck together and helped each other. And it was as different a picture that I got from these people as you could imagine from the picture I was carrying around in my mind from childhood.
It's interesting to me is that that's totally the same attitude that you have about your hometown, or the neighborhood that you grew up in as well. Safest place, doors unlocked, people looking out for each other. The definition of home.
Yeah, that's right. So one of the things that's really been driving me through all 3 of these novels is this difference between how black people see the world and how white people see the world. And I am blessed or cursed with, the ability to kind of step into other people's shoes. And
well, you're a writer. That's part and parcel, isn't it?
Well, yeah. And this is, I really want to do this. I really want to see the worlds that I'm inhabiting through black eyes and white eyes, if you will. That's what I'm after. And I really try. I've got my own views. I have my own opinions. They're pretty strong. I have my political views and my biases and stuff like that. But when I'm writing this stuff, I want to be fair to everybody. I want to love all my characters or hate them. Or I want, unfortunate. I want to get inside my characters' skins, and when I'm writing in their voices, I want to be them. And that means with Pinky, for example, Pinky is a real underclass girl. She is raised in squalor. She is raised by a heartless, uncaring woman who is only raising Pinky because she can get a welfare check as a result. And that way she won't have to get a regular job, and she can sponge off guys and do semi-illegal things. And, that is a different character, really, than the black kid in To Love Mercy, the character of Sass, who you know about. He's the son of a preacher, and although he too is a child of a very ghettoized neighborhood, Bronzeville, he is not lumpen proletariat. He is not underclass. He is a very streetwise kid who is probably 2 or 3 notches up the socioeconomic ladder from Pinky, although still not so great. But the white characters in this novel, and then there's Dora from the first novel. Dora was, she was born and raised in Sunflower, Mississippi. She chopped cotton, and then she came to the big city as a girl. And she entered domestic work, and she cleaned people's houses all her life. And the only thing that distinguishes Dora from just anybody is that Dora was one of the smartest people you could ever wish to meet, and a well of wisdom, and a woman with an extraordinary perspective on life and on the world, and a clear-eyed view of it all. And also a very devout woman who talked to Jesus every day. She had a relationship with Jesus that's the kind of relationship you have with your wife, or somebody has with their best friend. And she talks to Jesus throughout that novel. And it's just interesting. I'm Jewish, and the other character, Steve, is Jewish, and this background is very far from my background, but I had it in my house when I was 7 years old, 8 years old or so. I had Dora Winfield talking to me every afternoon, and her voice was in my bones. And when I started to write To Love Mercy, that voice came out, and I didn't even know it was in there. I hadn't thought about Dora Winfield for 40 years, and I started writing in Dora's voice, and I was sort of marveling at myself, like, wow, where did that come from? But it came from inside my bones.
How often do you think you thought about her over the 40 years prior to starting the novel?
Thought about
every
her.
day?
I barely thought about her at all until I started writing her as a fictional character and speaking in her voice.
I mean, it's obvious that you love the people that you're writing about. You dig deep and you try to figure out what these motivations are and what the best place for them going forward is. You want to fix them. I find that fascinating. I find it fascinating that you have written about a city that needs to get fixed as well. Let me ask, what you've written your trilogy, your Chicago trilogy. What are your plans going forward now? If you're putting these three to bed, you're never going to write them again.
It's
you
finished.
You pick up the pen tomorrow and you start writing another novel. What's your next novel about?
Well, it's completely different. A year ago, I started writing a novel that I can only describe as a romp. In this novel, Puerto Rico takes over the world. And there's an evil mad scientist type and an innocent young girl who's a biochemist who gets buffeted about, who is the protagonist of the novel, and a guy who bears an eerie resemblance to Ben having a senior moment. Ben Carson, Dr. Ben.
Okay, the politician, doctor.
Our new secretary
of HUD.
and a variety of other miscreants and evildoers. But in the course of the thing, it's a lot about the drug industry, and it's dystopian fiction kind of, and it's set a little bit in the future, and Puerto Rico, which is a place I've got kind of a connection to, winds up dominating the world because it controls the drug business, and some other things happen too. So I'm actually eager to pick that novel back up again.
Fantastic. Is that happening, or is it going to be happening?
Well, it's going to be happening, but it hasn't started happening. It's about a year since I wrote anything on it, but it's still.
What is your daily writing schedule like?
It's sporadic.
It's sporadic.
Yeah, I know writers. Writers when they're interviewed always say, "Well, I set aside, an hour every morning religiously, and I take my coffee into my little writing." I don't do that, unfortunately. I wish I did. I should. I'm very undisciplined. If I had been more disciplined, there'd be more than 3 novels. But
I wish you would find the discipline to do it, because it really sounds like you have eons of worlds within you that need to come out.
Oh, well, hopefully some of them will. But this world that I've been writing, I'm officially done with this world.
So the trilogy is a trilogy. You're not going to write another one.
No, I'm not going to write another one. This world, this story has been told. I have rounded out this story. I can't write more about the Chicago of my youth.
Of your youth.
And young adulthood, because I left Chicago in 1969, and To Do Justice ends in 1967. And so this isn't memoir, and it isn't the story of my life, literally, but it sure is, in a sense, the story of the life in which I grew up.
Yeah.
The times and the city and the place, and hopefully the people.
A more romantic time.
Yeah.
Because it's pretty sad state right now, other than your tourist section. Seems like the whole city's kind of falling apart a little bit. It seems like the whole world is kind of falling apart a little bit.
Well, Chicago's got a terrible press right now. Chicago's a great place. I love going back to Chicago. I don't get back there all that often, but I was back there last August, and I was a tourist. I stayed on the near north side in an Embassy Suites, and those streets, boy, people were out all hours and mingling, and happy crowd. These tourists from everywhere and locals and whatnot, and Nobody felt afraid on the near north side, but those people didn't get on the elevator and go out to North Lawndale, I'll tell you. And neither did I. I didn't have any intention of doing so. Although, can I tell you a story?
Please.
When I started writing To Do Justice, I knew I was writing it in North Lawndale, and so I took a trip to Chicago, and I happened to take the train from Washington, I live in the Washington area. And I took the train because I'm a train buff, and I like taking the train, and it's an overnight train, and it's fun in its own strange way. And I got off the train at Union Station, west of downtown Chicago, and I came up to the street, and I got in the taxi, and I said, "Take me to Lawndale." The taxi driver thought I was nuts, and I said, just drive west, go out to Roosevelt in California, and I just want to look around. So we did that. And the taxi driver took me around Lawndale for an hour or so. And what I discovered was there's nothing there. The riots occurred 50 years earlier, and the neighborhood over the years big chunks of it were leveled. There was some housing built, no commercial to speak of, but there was some subsidized housing, some project housing, some low-rise garden apartment type housing, and great tracts, blocks and blocks of empty lots.
Oh, wow.
Nothing. And I couldn't see the neighborhood I wanted to write about because it barely existed anymore. In what would that be? That would have been 5-6 years ago or so.
Is that South or North Lawndale?
West. The neighborhood itself is called North Lawndale.
North Lawndale, okay.
It is due west of downtown, and it is just about in the middle of the west side. The big streets are Roosevelt Road, Madison, Kedzie, Western Avenue, Pulaski Road, streets like that, Independence Boulevard.
That's it's fascinating to me that there's been desolated since 1965, where the Bronx up here, like the South Bronx, was also burning in the 60s, and nowadays it's just single family homes. All those projects have been removed, and all these little tiny duplexes have been built up.
Well, that happened in Bronzeville in Chicago. It did not happen on the west side. It did happen in Bronzeville. And let's go back to Bronzeville, which is on the south side, which is the neighborhood that the first novel, To Love Mercy, is set in. Then that close-knit community that I described a little earlier, Bronzeville was devastated another way. There was a wave of misguided urban renewal in the 50s and 60s, and Bronzeville was leveled, including the building that was in my grandfather's theater and everything else. Bronzeville was basically torn to the ground, not entirely, but a lot of Bronzeville. And what they did was they built these high-rise apartments, which became infamous. They had names like the Taylor homes, the Robert Taylor homes, and the Dearborn homes, and they were 16-story monstrosities where the worst crime and social breakdown and devastation took place. They became so infamous over the years. Killings, little children thrown off of 11th-story balconies.
Oh, man.
Awful, awful things. And eventually they got into the news, and eventually the Taylor homes were taken down. And when I'm talking about taken down Taylor homes, this was 2 or 3 miles of 16-story skyscrapers. And they were, over a period of some years, all of them were taken to the ground. And the final reconstruction of Bronzeville started taking place around the early part of the century, 40 years after the urban renewal had laid waste to it. And when I say laid waste, I mean laid waste. Bronzeville was nothing but high-rises and empty lots. And it was a terrible place. Talk about a misguided social program. The wave of urban renewal of the 60s just absolutely destroyed that city, that part of the city, which really was Chicago's Harlem. I've taken to calling it Chicago's Harlem because that's really what it was. It was a cultural treasure that was mowed to the ground. So anyway, here's what happened. That's
the good thing about New York is we still have our Harlem. And it's still kind of a cultural mecca, but it's getting gentrified a little bit, and the people that make it great are getting kind of shoved out.
Well, here's the rest of the story. Somewhere around the start of the 21st century, they started rebuilding Bronzeville, and it is not exactly what you just described in Harlem. It is yuppies and buppies.
Gentrification.
It is Jamba Juices and Starbuckses. There is a stock of wonderful old housing in parts of it that hasn't been torn down. Those have all been renovated, and they go for many millions of dollars. And the location of the neighborhood could not be better. It is 3.5 miles south of the Loop, and on great transportation downtown and everywhere. And it had laid fallow, for 40 years or so because of its history, because of the politics of Chicago, because Chicago doesn't get its act together, and race complicates things and class complicates things, and all those things happen. But eventually, once the Taylor homes and the Dearborn homes were out of the way, it was a safe place for middle class and upper middle class people to start moving back into, and the money started flowing back in. So that is the kind of bittersweet story of Bronzeville, and certainly the story of place, in a lot of cities. As you say, it's the story of Harlem in some sense.
So the people that would call Bronzeville home, they got shoved south.
Oh, they got shoved in every direction. They went into the projects. They went into neighborhoods farther south called Chatham, which is a very nice neighborhood. It's a middle-class black neighborhood, very nice neighborhood. They went to suburbs. They went to a suburb called Bolton, which is not a very nice place. They went to a suburb called Hazelcrest, which is not a very nice place. They went to Harvey, Illinois, which is not a very nice place. They scattered to the winds. Some probably went to the west side, but they didn't stay in Bronzeville for the most part because there wasn't Bronzeville.
Yeah.
I don't know what happened to all the people who used to populate the west side, which was a very densely populated place until the riots happened. And then, the riots were devastating. I wish I could share in this short hour we're going to talk. I wish I could share some of the prose that I've written about those riots because
hook me up with some links. I mean, we'll definitely put it on the show notes to the YouTube channel. Honestly, the story that you're telling me about Chicago is a story that every single major American city can be basically sharing in right now. Detroit, New York, Miami. They're all being devastated. The liveliness, the colors being drained out and the hopes that it gets green, right?
Well, that's all true. I'm telling this story in Chicago because that's the story that I know. But
you're speaking of America in the 20th century, 21st century.
Yeah, Chicago is not the only place this sort of thing happens, as you correctly point out. And I could, as easily be writing about Watts in 1965.
Absolutely.
Or Detroit during the riot, which I did cover. And
I almost hope that one day, I understand, you want to move away from your childhood and your youth in Chicago, and you explore some of these themes of, urban blight, restructuring of these great American cities. What's happening to these populations? Are they in prison? Are they dead? Where are they moving to? I asked my wife a month or two ago, I wondered, if you want a cool place to live, find out where the drag queens move to, because they can't afford to live anywhere. They can't afford to live anywhere in the big cities anymore.
Follow the artists.
Follow the artists is what I mean. Follow the colorful souls. Where are we living? Where are they at?
That's right.
And unfortunately, we're not living in Harlem anymore, and we're not living in Bronzeville or anywhere cool. We're being shoved to our mother's basements or something. I don't know.
The artists and the drag queens are the social pioneers of America's cities, and they all
think so.
Have been.
So let's get to your writing a little bit. I understand, you're quite prolific in terms of your history. What do you hope to do with your future, and how do you hope to get some eyes on your fiction?
Well, I'm going to be real practical and businesslike here and hard-headed. On Saturday, I went to a writers' conference here in the Washington area where there were literary agents, and I pitched 4 of them. 3 of them gave me a lot of encouragement, and all 3 asked to see the entire manuscript of To Do Justice. I think it helped a lot that I won that Scintillating Starts contest. Not that it's such a prominent contest, but because of its great name, Scintillating Start. But here's a little fact about the publishing business and editors and literary agents. All they care about is the start. If you don't grab them in the first 5 pages, or really the first 5 paragraphs, they're not going to read on. And so to win a novel called Scintillating Starts is a big selling point, and I'm hoping that it cuts a lot of ice with literary agents. Now, the next question you could ask is, why a literary agent? Why not self-publish?
Yeah, exactly. If you're going indie, you're going traditional, but you're going traditional all the way, right?
Why not post it on Amazon?
But that I did with my novel.
Really, I mean, then you'll probably know what I'm talking about when I say that what I'm writing is Barnes and Noble fiction. You know, what I'm writing is trade fiction. It is meant to be read by a large, broad, general audience. I am speaking to people. I'm not speaking to, dog lovers. I'm not speaking to knitters. I'm speaking to a lot of people. I am speaking to Chicagoans, probably speaking to Jews and Black people, maybe a little bit more than some other people. I don't know. But I'm trying to speak to a very broad audience. And for that, I need to be published by Simon & Schuster. I need to be published by Alfred Knopf. I need to be published by Random House. And the path to that is almost invariably through a literary agent. So the first thing I got to do is win over a literary agent, and then hope that he or she wins over a publisher, and then really cross my fingers and hope that the publisher not only publishes To Do Justice, which is the third and final novel of the trilogy, but also goes back and republishes To Love Mercy and publishes To Walk Humbly, which we haven't really talked about, but
No, we're going to get there. Let me ask you, though, in terms of getting the attention of a literary agent, do you wholeheartedly go into the convention type attitude, or are you writing query letters as well? Are you a face-to-face guy, basically, is what I'm asking?
The answer to that is yes, I am a face-to-face guy, but that's not going to be enough. I was face-to-face with 4 agents on Saturday. 3 of them gave me some encouragement. The 4th was a total loss.
75% is pretty good, man.
Well, that's not bad. I mean, I feel pretty good.
Yeah, I'm pretty jealous, actually.
There were 3 other agents at that meeting that I'm planning to query by letter that I didn't get a chance to meet. And then after that's all done, I am going to do what everybody says to do: get a copy of Literary Marketplace, or go online and find the database and start looking through there for agents who are likely to be predisposed to the kind of fiction that I'm writing, and just start querying my brains out.
And you haven't done that with either of the first 2 novels either.
That is the step that follows querying the 7 agents that I've targeted who were at the Books Alive conference. But that's the marketing plan. As you know, because we have a little history together, the first novel was not published that way. It was published by a very small publisher in Huntington, West Virginia, of all the unlikely places, by a guy whose company was by a company called Publisher's Place, an imprint actually, a Publisher's Place called Mid-Atlantic Islands, whose owner was a guy I worked with at the Associated Press a lifetime earlier. He and I were friends. I was working on the city desk, and he was filing the radio wire, and his name was Patrick O'Keefe. He changed his name later on to Patrick Grace, but at that time it was Pat O'Keefe. And he was 2 years younger than me, I think, or a year younger than me. And he was married to his first wife, Jo, and I knew them, and I had been in their apartment, and we were kind of friends. We lived about 4 blocks from each other, and he was kind of a friend. And years afterward, I mean, many years afterward, like in the late, like 1998 or so, or 1999, Patrick called me out of the blue. Now, I had a little contact with him over the years, once or twice. He'd come to town and, look me up. And so it wasn't as if we were exactly out of touch, but we hadn't been close touch either. So he calls me out of the blue and he says, "I saw you quoted in the publication of a trade association called IBPA that we both belong to, as it happened." And he said, "I didn't know you were a publisher." And I said, "I didn't know you were a publisher." And so we catch up and we're talking for a half an hour or so. And I asked him, "Do you ever publish fiction?" And he said, "Yes, I do." And I said, "Well, I've written some." And he said, "Well, send it to me." And I sent it to him, and he got back to me and he said, Great novel. I want to publish it." Well, that was a pretty good offer. And it was the only person who made an offer to me like that. And my head was turned. And so I went with Patrick, and he published To Love Mercy. And it did okay under, depending on how you look at it. Teeny tiny publisher with no resources, no market presence. But he did have a few connections, and he was able to put out a good book. He did a great job on To Love Mercy. He really did. It's a good book, and it looks great, and it's got a great cover. And he did a fine job on the book, and he did make a couple of very critical contacts, which was great. And he also had marketing channels at that time. I don't think he still does, but at that time, he could get a book into Barnes & Noble. He could get a book into Borders, which at that time was Barnes & Noble's big competitor. He could get a book into any independent bookstore in America. And so he had distribution, which is key for the kind of novel I was writing. So Patrick and I brainstormed a marketing plan, which we decided to focus on Chicago, because in the hopes that we could make a splash in Chicago, because the novel was so centered in Chicago and about Chicago, and hope for concentric circles radiating outward. And that was the plan. Over the next 2 years or so, 2.5 years, I made 7 trips to Chicago. I had more than 80 appearances.
Wow.
We just sold our business, and I was free to do it. I had the time, and I flogged the daylights out of that baby, and it got a good deal of attention. I had some great appearances. I had one appearance where I probably spoke to more than 80 people, and I had more than one appearance where I spoke to like 1 or 2 people. It was humiliating, but I did it. I soldiered on, and I had some pretty interesting experiences on the road. Some wonderful things came out of that. One of the most wonderful was I spoke at a middle school in the Northwest Side, and I was invited to become a writer in residence at the school. And I went back and I spent a week teaching middle schoolers how to write narrative.
That's neat.
It was a neat experience. And also, the book had a huge second life in the Chicago public schools because they got wind of it. I won't go into that story. It's an interesting story, but I won't go into it.
Why not? Good. Take your time. Well, tell me about it.
I happened to get connected with a school librarian who was probably one of the most brilliant marketing geniuses I've ever known in my life. And she just took me in hand, and she milked all of her contacts, and I started getting appearances all around town in the Chicago public schools. And the book had a huge second life in the Chicago public schools, sold, I don't know, couple thousand copies, went on some curriculums. I spoke before assemblies. I spoke at that middle school that I mentioned. That was a really, really interesting experience. I appeared twice at a school that growing up, I had viewed as a reform school. I came to discover it wasn't exactly that, but it was a school for very, very seriously, problem child kids. And that was one of my biggest hits. The school was called Montefiore. And man, I knocked them dead at Montefiore. I gotta say it. I didn't know what I was going to say, and I was kind of scared. It's in a bad neighborhood, and I had this reputation from when I was a little kid. Teachers would say, if you're bad, we'll send you to Montefiore. And that was the image I had. So I was getting ready to appear before a big assembly of the school. And I was in the men's room, relieving myself, thinking about what the hell am I going to say to these kids? And it dawned on me. And I went out in front of these kids and I said, when I was a kid growing up, I thought Montefiore was the worst school in Chicago. I thought it was a reform school. And I thought that if you were bad, if you were a bad kid, they were going to send you to Montefiore. Are you bad kids? And of course, everybody went, no! And after that, they were eaten out of my hand. It was a fabulous experience.
I'm really happy to hear that. And what I did when I worked for Publishers Place was make hundreds and hundreds of calls on your behalf all around Chicago. I'm not sure if I hooked you up at that middle school or whether somebody else did it, but I'm so happy that, that it's just an example of what can happen if you get the right person at the right time. It just can rain success for you.
Brian, I am forever grateful to you for doing that. And there was a girl named April, too, and she did some of it, too.
April was awesome. She did a lot of graphic art for Patrick.
Yeah. I wonder what happened to April. I lost touch with her. She was great.
I'm not quite sure. I lost touch with her as well. That was a neat experience for me working for you. You were my first kind of author that I talked to when I graduated college. So, I just was very interested in seeing what would happen with you. And
that is cool. I didn't know that at the time.
No, I was desperate for work. I was desperate. Patrick hooked me up. I understand just life experience. I mean, it wasn't a very long experience. I got to talk to you on the phone, which I knew that you were a very good talker, which made me interested in reaching out to you and seeing if I can get you to talk a little bit on the podcast. And I do not regret this at all. You've been a fantastic conversationalist, and I don't know. What do you think? Anything else you want to mention before we sum it up?
Well, right back at you. You conduct a hell of an interview, my friend.
Well, I'm only like 10% of it. The 90% was all you.
Yeah, this has been good fun. I got to mention the website, www.frankjoseph.com. It's real easy, frankjoseph.com.
And don't forget, autographed copies if you buy through the website.
Thank you for mentioning that. You can go to the website, frankjoseph.com, and buy a copy of To Love Mercy, my first novel, and it says $14.95, but for listeners of this podcast, it's $10, shipping included, and you'll get an autographed copy from me.
And it's a good read. It's really a lot of fun to see a world just gone. That's probably never going to be again in human history. It's nice. It's interesting because I'm happy I got to read it, and I'm happy that I got to talk to you as well. The show notes will have everything that we need as far as contacting you. Your Twitter's on there, your Facebook, your website. Mr. Joseph, it was a wonderful experience, and I'm so happy that you spent the last hour with me.
Well, thank you. I enjoyed it no end.
You have a wonderful, and hopefully we can do it again. We'll sit down and have another conversation, especially when
the other ones are published. Man, I look forward to that.
Yeah, just let me know. I pay attention to your blogs, your blog posts every time you send one. Let your followers know that you've appeared and hook me up with some viewers and listeners, or maybe direct them to my novel on Amazon.com. It's up to you.
Absolutely, I will do that. And hopefully people will sign up for my blog or my email list.
And that's directly through frankjoseph.com. They can sign up for your blog, right?
Yeah, they can. Or send an email to frank@frankjoseph.com.
Perfect. All right, Mr. Joseph. Thank you again. You have a wonderful day.
You too. Thank you again.
No problem, sir. Bye-bye. And that was Frank Joseph. It was check out the show notes. He has a discount available to anybody who mentions the show. Free shipping on his website. Contact information for him, it will be in the show notes. www.brianayellow.com. Follow me on Twitter at BRYAIELLO. And we've got another episode coming up on Tuesday, another one following that on Thursday. We're going to try to keep this thing rolling Tuesdays and Thursdays. If you want to chat, there is an application form on the website. Fill that out. Yeah, so pretty much it. I really appreciate you listening. It's been a lot of fun. I've had some really great guests, a lot of great conversations coming up. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.